I want to start with just a simple point. Abolish Human Abortion is an ideology. It is not an organization. Yes, you're sitting in a building. Yes, we have an office. We have a store. We have a Facebook page. We have a whole lot of things. Blog, all that kind of stuff. We are peddlers and purveyors of an ideology. We are trying to grow and spread a specific way of thinking about the world, and in particular, its application to abortion. And when we use the word abolitionist, we think that it has a specific meaning that is rooted and connected to what earlier abolitionists in history understood the word to mean and defined it by their actions and by their words, and we are walking in line with it. We are not seeking to create a synonym for pro-life activist. For those of you who are on Facebook and follow this, you've probably figured that out, and the pro-life movement has helped us to draw that distinction well. And so hopefully by the end of the day, you will have a lot of that lined out. But first, to introduce, I want to actually talk about the history of AHA. Like, where did abolitionism in its current manifestation come from? Where did the symbol come from? Why is it in Norman, Oklahoma? Why are we in this building? So on and so forth. Because everyone from the Abolitionist Society of Oklahoma has heard me talk about all this, but I can subject the rest of you to it. So the title of this talk is The Reignition of Abolitionism in America. I am from the ivory tower, okay? I am a navel gazer. I read books, I think about philosophy and history and ideology, and I would much rather be sitting and drinking coffee, reading those books, and not talking to people about the most vicious act of dehumanization ever to occur on this planet. And that's what I was doing when I was a pro-lifer, a Christian, an active member of another ivory tower. And before I was involved in AHA, when John Wagner brought JFA to the campus, the University of Oklahoma, and brought a bunch of people from a local church to engage people on the campus about abortion, I didn't go because I was going to sit in my office in the Physical Science Center and study the history of science, because I was focused on the history of Darwinism, intelligent design, creation, evolution, that sort of deal. That was my issue. Abortion was someone else's issue, and you know, that's what I was doing. And in 2008, 2009, some things started to change. I was writing a dissertation. Sorry, this is going to be a nerdy talk. I was writing a dissertation on the metaphysical foundations of Darwin's theory, with the thesis that the Descent of Man was his chief work, not the Origin of Species. He just wrote the Origin of Species to justify where he was going in the Descent. And I was knee-deep. You can ask my wife. My house is full of books on Darwin. I've read more about Charles Darwin than anyone in like a 500 square mile radius. And I was just studying Darwinism. And in 2009, in response to a book that a scholar with the Discovery Institute wrote, connecting Darwinism to Hitler, the head sort of minds, the chief minds of the Darwin industry, which I was a sycophant of, I was a fledgling member of the Darwin industry, they came out with a book called Darwin's Sacred Cause. And the thesis was pretty much that Darwin had put forward his theory of evolution by natural selection as part of a sacred cause to end slavery. I don't know if any of you guys read this book. I read this book a couple of times, and as someone working on Darwinism, I found it just fascinatingly and ignorantly interesting. Because they were making the case that Darwin was motivated by his desire to abolish slavery, and I had read all of Darwin's journals and all of his letters from whenever he was like 25 to like 32, and he rarely ever mentioned slavery except to justify it as sort of probably part of the war of nature. And the interesting thing about the book is that anytime that Desmond and Moore, which these are actually leaders in the field of Darwin studies, anytime that Desmond and Moore talked about the abolitionists, he kind of said, oh, and then there were these abolitionists, you know, like William Wilberforce and then William Garrison, and they were trying to end slavery too. But Darwin, he was the one that really put a nail in the coffin, because he showed that black people and white people were related to a common ancestor, and so therefore they were all people. And then there'd be a footnote, and it would say something along the lines of course, the abolitionists of slavery thought that black people and white people were related in Adam and of one blood and created in the image of God and valuable and all this kind of stuff, but that was a different theory. And so I'm reading this. I'm in the ivory tower, secure. I'm drinking coffee on your tax dollars. And I'm just, chilling. I'm a Christian, I'm a decent chap. I vote pro-life. And I am studying this book, and I think, man, I got to go study the abolitionists of slavery. Something is off here. So I start going and reading Wilberforce, Clarkson, Granville Sharp. I start going through all of the abolitionists of slavery that Darwin is supposed to be sort of rescuing with his theory. And what I find is that the abolitionist of slavery thought that the slave was a man and a brother. He was created in the image of God, and as a brother, because of the incarnation of Christ, he was, the neighbor, which Christ said, hey, love your neighbor. And this was a motivating factor, that the verses about loving your neighbor, keeping the golden rule, and all this kind of stuff were on all of the anti-slavery coins. That the image of the slave on bended knee, praying to God, that said, am I not a man and a brother, was a romantic theological image signaling to the people in British culture that, hey, what we are doing to the slaves, we are doing to Christ, because of what it says in Matthew 25, whatever we do to these. And so I'm seeing all these arguments that none of the historians and scholars are actually saying that the abolitionists of slavery made. And I'm like really confused as to why these bozos left it out of their book. And that's because Darwin is proposing a completely opposite secular story. Man is not created in the image of God. Man is a beast of a higher degree, but the same kind of thing as an animal, not created in the image of God. And there, of course, is no incarnation of Christ in Darwinism, but you don't want to get me talking about Darwinism. We'll be here till 10 instead of 9. So I saw these two opposite things. All right, hold that in your mind. So I'm reading Wilberforce, I'm reading Darwin, I'm comparing them. Completely different worldviews, different ideologies, and they're playing out differently. Wilberforce's ideology makes him wake up every day and try to abolish slavery. Darwin's ideology makes him wake up every day and play with barnacles. Y'all know what barnacles are? Okay. So I'm doing this. In the meantime, at my other ivory tower, because I'm very active at the university, and I'm entering my ABD, all but dissertation phase. At the church that I was going to, I was a member of this sort of like esteemed elite theological discussion group called the Round Table. And I was also working for a local pastor on helping him to develop a thing called the Wilberforce Initiative. And so for this local pastor, I was taking what I was reading about the abolitionists of slavery and developing an ideology for this Wilberforce Initiative. And for this round table, which was, the way this basically works is you have a group of guys, 6 guys, and they're given tasks at random. There's like a set of ethical quandaries, and they're given at random. And then they have to like put together presentations, present them, and then defend them in a round table setting. So I'm reading The Abolitionist, I'm reading Wilberforce, I go to round table, the pastor, the first assignment he gives me is infanticide and euthanasia.
So I'm reading Abolitionist, I'm studying infanticide and euthanasia. And by the way, I've never read a pro-life book or been to a pro-life anything, you know. I think I voted for George Bush, but I don't know if that counts. But here I am, and I'm studying infanticide. And I'm looking at the early church and how they dealt with infanticide. I'm looking at infanticide, I'm looking at euthanasia, I'm looking at the arguments, and I start to think, well, this is weird, because a lot of the arguments about like dehumanizing people in order to justify their destruction and so on and so forth that are playing out in this infanticide discussion throughout time are very similar to what the abolitionists were dealing with. And the way the abolitionists dealt with slavery that I'm studying about are very similar to the way the early Christians dealt with infanticide, child abandonment, and so on and so forth. And I'm just doing this, I'm just chilling. I'm still in my ivory tower. At about this time, my little sister's roommate almost has an abortion, and I am part of the sort of get you to the crisis pregnancy center, don't let you do that. But I'm an ivory tower guy, so I just did my due diligence there. A couple of months go by, continuing to develop the Wilberforce initiative. The next topic I'm given is civil disobedience. I have to defend civil disobedience for Roundtable. And so I'm studying the history of civil disobedience, social action, all this kind of stuff. I'm like, man, this is draining me. I should be studying Darwinism. And so I'm studying civil disobedience, and I'm looking at stuff, and I'm seeing that like Martin Luther King and William Lloyd Garrison and Thoreau and those guys, they were talking about civil disobedience. They connected it to the early church. They connected it to what they were doing. They connected it to the image of God, because it was okay to break the law whenever the government was doing something they couldn't do, which was destroying humans. I'm just reading it, and I'd have to defend civil disobedience. And then the next topic I got in Roundtable, to go a little faster, was revolution. Like as in, is revolution permissible within Christendom? So infanticide, civil disobedience, revolution. This pastor is just handing these to me. At about this time, I am probably, weirding people out, because I start in my little moleskins trying to come up with symbols. And I don't know why. Because like the early Christians had a symbol. They would draw like fishes on things. Or like they'd etch it on things. Or like, we've been here, we're dissidents of the culture. And then the anti-slavery Christians had a symbol. Am I not a man and a brother? They put it on everything. And I'm just kind of like going, you know what? The pro-life movement, which I don't know anything about, they probably need a symbol. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm sure my wife's getting a little angry with me because I'm no longer opening my dissertation file. I'm just studying all this stuff for my ivory tower church. And I'm like, pretty good. Defend the legitimacy of revolutionary action, Christian principles. And I've read probably, books on the abolitionists of slavery. And I start to go, man, I'm going to look at the pro-life movement. I'm just going to peruse it. I look at websites, ordered a bunch of pro-life books, studied it, what was going on. They too talked about the image of God in man. Less about the incarnation, maybe around Christmas. But they made similar arguments, and they seem to be facing similar opponents, about the humanity of man and the humanity being where we get our value from in creation in the image of God. And I started looking at it, but I started looking at the pro-life movement, and I said, but there's a lot of differences. For all the kind of surface level similarities of the situation, there are a lot of differences between the pro-life movement that I'm reading about, which wasn't the pro-life movement that any of you fine people participate in. It was the pro-life movement compared with the abolitionists of slavery. The abolitionists of slavery were these ideologues who would wake up in the morning and go study the Bible for 6 hours and then, have breakfast. And they were fiercely vocal in their theological motivations and presuppositions. And you may think, well, it was a different time. It was maybe a more Christian time. No, they actually ran up. When Wilberforce, would do his thing, like the Earl of Abington would say, like, it's come to a pretty fine pass that a man will bring his religion into public. In like 1787, that was being said. Lord North and those guys used that argument a lot. Like the same argument that the Earl of Abington used, we heard on Main Street last night when we were protesting. But they were upfront with their theological presuppositions and motivations, and they were upfront with sort of this bold denial of pragmatism, and they were upfront with this sort of like seeing what they were doing in line with providence, and it didn't seem to be lip service. And I just saw a character in them that I wasn't seeing in at least the literature that I was reading until I started reading George Grant and Joseph Foreman and some others, but in what I was looking at like on websites and so on and so forth. So I start thinking, I'm an ivory tower snob. I will write a book telling the pro-life movement how to do their thing. And I will make them a symbol. And I will bequeath it to them. And they can put it on everything. And then they, and so I start doing this kind of as a hobby. And then I get my final assignment in Roundtable, abortion. And so I have a two-part thing. I have to defend, abortion, for it or against it, why, biblical, scientific, philosophical. And I'm given this task, and I study abortion a whole lot. And I'm just starting to think, dear God, you're going to make me drop out of grad school and fight abortion. And I'm like a little worried. Because about this time, that girl that didn't have the abortion brings her baby over to the house, and I've like emerged from an office, hung over from coffee, and it's like, hey, here's that baby that we saved. And I'm holding this baby, and my wife, and my sister, and they're just sitting there, and I'm just like, this child exists because my sister is vocal about like abortion being the evil of our age. My apolitical hipster, no, she's not a hipster, she's like hippie, who thinks abortion is like denying the incarnation of Christ, and my world's just kind of messing up. So then I go and I present my stuff on abortion. And standing in the living room of this pastor's house where we're all sort of gathered around, I am given the topic for part 2 of my thing is something about, it's like abortion and voting is like my topic. And this is May of 2011 by this point. So abortion and voting. And I'm supposed to talk about, well, can you vote for a pro-life candidate for a pro-choice platform and a pro-choice candidate for a pro-life, and all these kind of questions. And I stand up in front of about 60 people as the end of the year roundtable thing, and I basically answer that question. It's like, no, you can never ever vote for anyone who actually thinks that it is permissible to kill a preborn human being. You just can't. Like, that was the only thing that I could do as a Christian. I looked at Christianity, and I said, these are interesting questions, Pastor, but actually I can't vote for anyone who would permit it ever in any circumstance. And I give this sort of like paper, or I answer that question in 20 seconds. And then for the other 10 minutes of my presentation, I basically say, you know what we ought to do? We ought to sort of launch local abolitionist societies. They ought to spread out across the country. They should be in every city and every town. They should be autonomous. They should be run by the people in that town. They should be run by people who just integrate that as part of what it means to be a Christian. They should participate in both agitation and assistance. They should be one group. They all live in, say, Norman, and since they're different people with different gifts, they should be doing crisis pregnancy centers, and they should be doing graphic images, and they should be in the same group, and they should all be doing it because they're Christians and they're trying to keep the commandments of God. And I, say this and give a couple of ideas about civil disobedience and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, I don't know, there were some of the people in that room that night, I don't know if it was very good or anything, it was probably rambling like this, but it was basically the first declaration of what I was going to spend the rest of my life doing, and that was reigniting an abolitionist movement. Because I actually, and I could be wrong on this, I don't pretend that I'm not on this, but I actually thought that there was no abolitionist movement, even though there were hundreds of pro-life organizations. There was no abolitionist movement. Because an abolitionist movement would be groups subscribing to an ideology, not organizations trying to save babies. Preface. The British abolitionists were known as a sect. Fanatics, moral busybodies, people that you did not want to talk to or know, okay? Holier than thou people, Pharisees, okay? They were called a sect derogatorily. They all lived with each other and had all things in common, kind of weird stuff like in Acts. But they were also called saints, which was also derogatory. And they were people who are famous for abolishing the slave trade. They happen to also be the principal people behind like the Tract Society and the Missionary Society and the fighting the prison systems and the poor and all these kinds of things. They were social reformers, and the principal question that they asked is, what does Christianity look like in a culture that XYZ famously steals human beings and trades them like property? Well, Exodus 20 says, anyone is a man stealer, it's a capital crime, and so they knew that was wrong, so slave trade was easy. But they asked themselves, what does Christianity look like? I could get really pedantic and start reading books, but they never actually got together and said, hey guys, how do we save the slaves? Seriously. Go through the abolitionist literature and see if their mantra is, how do we save the slaves? They say, hey, so we're a bunch of evangelical Christians, we're coming out of the Great Awakening, we really like Whitefield and Wesley and those kind of guys, and we're just trying to wonder, I'm a Christian, what does that look like in this culture? Because everyone else seems to be addicted to rum and tea and don't really care about the fact that the sugar is produced by people dying every 4 years. When they went about this, they were very clever. Josiah Wedgwood, one of the members of Clapham, drew up this picture. Talented guy, potter. You can still buy Wedgwood pottery at Dillard's. And they infused their ideology into their symbol. And then they put their symbol on stuff and they put it everywhere. If you wanted to buy a teapot, it was going to have this on there. Because Wedgwood was saying, guess what? I eat the best pottery, and I'm an abolitionist. If you were at some shipping docks, you would see it on manifestos. You would see it on coins. You'd see it on brooches. You would see it on watches. You would see it on snuff boxes. You would see it on everything. Kids would stitch it like at home for fun. And it was their way of saying, we're not going to take this anymore. In America, the abolitionists, they took it up a notch. They weren't derided as saints or a sect. They were derided as holy warriors and prophets of protest, and they were hated. We'll talk more about them throughout the day, men like Garrison and Wendell Phillips and so on and so forth. But these were guys who stood up in the midst of a culture where in Britain, slavery was going on out here, and they were economically benefiting from it. In America, it was going on everywhere. If you spend $5 today, some of your money is going to Planned Parenthood. Regardless. I mean, if you have an Android or you have an iPhone or whatever, some of your money goes to Planned Parenthood. There is no way not to be paying for abortion right now. There was no way for people to not be participating in slavery at their time. They were immersed in it. And the abolitionists of slavery stood up and they decried the Northern Church, the Southern slave power, the whole system. The main people they fought and this is where by this time, I'm not even studying Darwin anymore. I'm like studying the controversies in the anti-slavery movement in the 1830s. The principal opponents of the abolitionists of slavery were the anti-slavery American Colonization Society people who had been fighting slavery for like 40 years. The abolitionists of slavery said, man, you know what? You can just call it sin. The American Colonization Society people said, you know what? We're not going to call it sin. People are doing it, and no, you need to actually discipline slaveholders in your church. No, we're not going to do it because he's such a good tithe payer. Well, you need to actually do it. Well, we're going to kick you out of our church. And in a couple of years, we're going to split this whole denomination. The abolitionists of slavery were calling it sin and decrying it. They were saying, we will not go with the multitude to do evil. That is how Garrison defined abolitionism. They asked the question, what does Christianity look like in a culture that treats human beings like animals? Because human beings were created in the image of God, and they were your neighbor, and it was like treating Christ like an animal or treating your neighbor like chattel. So they formed local abolition societies. They spread out across the world. They went to war with the South using the printing press. They basically took whatever the chief technological form of communication at the time was. They tried to do it as legitimately as possible. They created propaganda. Well, Martin Luther kind of created propaganda, but they perfected it. Patron saint of propaganda, Martin Luther. Guy was going around town nailing things up on walls. They basically took the Facebook of their day and they inundated it with abolitionism, with their symbol, with their ideas, their ideology, and they were relentless. And they bothered with trying to make it look good. All with the goal of the redemption of man from the dominion of man. Does someone have the time that I can see?
10:49, or 9:49. So.
Will you just tell me when to stop?
When are you supposed to stop?
I have no idea.
10:25. 30 minutes.
Okay. And I want to stop earlier than that since we started late. And we just do that through the day. But the abolitionists of slavery were not popular. They're popular today. In America, at the beginning of the abolitionist movement, 3% of the people in the North were considered abolitionists, members of abolitionist societies. When it started to get a little more realistic and feasible, it went up to about 10%. And then when Abraham Lincoln gave his Emancipation Proclamation, a few years later, all the colonization people said, hey, we were abolitionists. And it went up to like 80% of the North was abolitionist. True story. And that's because Lincoln did the fun thing that's been really helpful of saying, oh, it was the Garrisonians. Look it up. Abraham Lincoln credited the Garrisonians and the Army for causing him to make the Emancipation Proclamation. What the Garrisonians did is they walked around saying, listen, church, you're recreant to your post. Pastor, you are an apostate. The South, you are a brothel. These people were calling sin, sin, and they were doing it at such an alarming rate that everyone hated them, but everyone slowly but surely was becoming more and more opposed to slavery. Not as opposed as the abolitionists, but more opposed, because they were the agitator. And, they sought to undermine the world's empires and institutions. So to return to an earlier note that I kind of went off on, everyone knows a lot about Wilberforce and how basically he's a champion of the anti-slavery cause in Britain. If y'all haven't read Eric Metaxas's kind of popular biography, he makes an interesting point. He says that the most significant thing that William Wilberforce ever did was convert to Christianity. Like, it literally said, like, when you look back at the whole history of it, like, what was the most important thing for the abolition of the slave trade? It was when William Wilberforce is sitting in a buggy talking about Philip Doddridge's The Rise and Progress of the Soul or Religion and the Soul of Man, and undergoes a conversion and then starts reading the New Testament in Greek. That's how my conversion happened. Spiritual gift of Greek. And Wilberforce converted to Christianity, thought about leaving politics. I'm really abbreviating the story. You can watch it in Amazing Grace where they get a lot of it wrong, but enough of it right. But basically, William decides that he's going to stay in politics at the request of John Newton and William Pitt, who encourage him and say things like, divine providence has raised you up for this purpose. And William Wilberforce is like, yeah, it's just really kind of weird, you know, because basically I'm just like a playboy, I'm kind of wealthy, I'm likable, I've got a good singing voice, none of this really works, except for it does. Perfect for the parliamentary struggle against slavery. His entire life was this providential train building him to the point of view where he was meant to leave his... Wilberforce probably would have been prime minister. Like, people kind of agree, historians don't talk about what would have happened, but Wilberforce. And he decided to start hanging out with people like Thomas Clarkson and Equiano and all those guys that appear in the movie, and other unsavory characters. But William Wilberforce dies to William Wilberforce, and he takes up the cross which he has been given, which is going tirelessly over and over and over and over again to both abolitionist society meetings and to parliamentary meetings where he puts forward bills, participates in petitions, participates in activism, participates in research, so on and so forth, devotes his life to ending slavery and does end the slave trade. They had a sort of a weird, Grant will talk more about it later, but they hadn't developed immediatism yet. Wilberforce repented of that. But eventually, 3 days before he died, he got news of the abolition of slavery. A little bit before that, he got a letter from John Wesley, who said, well, much earlier than that, John Wesley, who told him, here's the deal, you will not succeed unless divine providence has raised you up for this purpose. Fighting slavery will chew you up and spit you out. And that's true. It didn't chew William Wilberforce up and spit him out, and he fought it. Okay, that's a very bad historic. That's not the way I would do it at a conference. Here's the point. What was William Wilberforce? A navel gazer. I'm not trying to make a case that I'm William Wilberforce, by the way, but William Wilberforce was a navel gazer. William Wilberforce was a bookworm, and William Wilberforce, at the height of the campaign against the slave trade, wrote a book. I can't memorize it. I'm going to read it. This is the title of William Wilberforce's book. You're Fighting Slavery. How to Save the Slaves. Nope. A practical view of the prevailing religious system of professed Christians in the higher and middle classes contrasted with real Christianity. And it's like 380 pages of William Wilberforce saying, here's what Christianity is. These people call themselves Christians. These are very different. The whole book. These people think this. This is true Christianity. Blah, blah, blah. And you're like, what does this have to do with slavery? Only in a culture full of people claiming to be Christians, not acting like Christians, orienting their lives around non-Christian principles, would you ever get anything like piling people on top of each other and killing half of them, taking boats across the Atlantic. They weren't Christian.
And the remedy for ending the slave trade was revival. And it was a revival of what William Wilberforce called vital Christianity, and what subsequent people have called true Christianity, or like Francis Schaeffer might call Christian Christianity. Francis Schaeffer. And, but that's what William Wilberforce was doing, the height of the slave trade. Writing a book telling people that they weren't Christian. This is very, very different from the pro-life movement. Now, he was doing things like writing books like on the horrors of slavery, making arguments that were purely secular in form. He was doing things like collecting testimonies that were emotive. He was doing all that, but he definitely was not leaving God out. It wasn't like, we will save the slaves and then we may share Jesus with you. And that is what I was seeing in many in the pro-life movement. And I was also seeing sort of this disdain towards ideology, and this disdain towards sort of like saying, it's because I'm Christian. If I had $1 for every time I heard, you don't have to be a Christian to think abortion's evil, which is true. I mean, I'm saying that is true. You don't have to be a Christian to think abortion's evil. But why in the world are we trying to fight abortion by saying you don't have to be Christian? Very different from the abolitionist of slavery. Okay, the other guy, I probably don't have to argue that the guy on the right is a navel gazer or a bookworm. That's William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison, who said, what did William Lloyd Garrison say? The famous thing.
Russ is the guy on the left. Garrison's right. Garrison's on the left, Wilberforce on the right.
Yeah, sure. Garrison's left. No, that doesn't make sense either. Shh, just let me be dumb. Quote, this is after he is asked pardon of his God, his country, and his brethren, the poor slaves, for being timid and unjust and absurd. William Wilberforce is like apologizing for being guilty, for being timid. For those of you guys who know anything about William Wilberforce, that's funny. But the thing is he's repenting of his involvement in the anti-slavery movement, because he's broken with them, and this is his first editorial in his Liberator in 1831. Famously, I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. No, no. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. The apathy of the people is enough to make every statue leap from its pedestal and to hasten the resurrection of the dead. And then he writes a paragraph, and he's like, man, I love God, as is custom. You see this quote a lot, except for all that immediatism in the middle. It usually starts out, I'll be as harsh as truth, and then it's like, I will not equivocate, I will be heard. But that's a very famous quote. That's William Lloyd Garrison. What is going on with this guy? He wakes up in the morning, he goes to his press, he writes editorials, he creates propaganda. He sits around and he thinks about these things, and he writes these articles, and he sends them to the South, and then he goes down to the church in the North, and he's like, hey, pastor, do you want to maybe do some stuff to maybe fight slavery and stuff like that? Much more eloquent, because he's William Lloyd Garrison. And then that pastor says, well, I do think slavery is wrong, but we have to keep the main thing. And, actually, and I will provide the reference for anyone who's interested. I didn't plan this in the talk. What they developed when the abolitionists came on the scene was Sanctity of Life Sundays,
where pastors in the North would devote one sermon every year to preaching against slavery. That died out during civil rights and subsequent history, and then has come back. But the pastors would subsequently run Garrison and his immediatists out of their churches, saying that their view of sin was perfectionist because, well, you've got sin, it's there and it's bad and it's wicked, but you know, Jesus said go and sin less and then gradually get better. But Garrison was, and I've read most of Garrison's editorials, and what Garrison was doing was Garrison was reading the Old Testament prophets, ripping them off, translating them into modern English, and saying them against the church. And he was basically taking biblical principles and putting them in application. The Bible says if you have sin, you cease from doing it. The moment you are convicted of sin, you cease from doing it. He said, oh, okay, that's interesting. Hey, you got all these slaveholders in your church. Rebuke them, you know. These were better times. But William Lloyd Garrison was, yes, he did print images. Yes, he did do that sort of thing. But he wrote, and he wrote, and he wrote, and he wrote, and he made ideological arguments. I don't even know what my next slide is. They were zealots and fanatics who sought to under... Oh, no, I was supposed to transition. So essentially, I'm looking at these guys. I'm looking at the pro-life movement. I'm looking at the situation. Abortion and slavery are not the same thing. But we live in a country where it's like half and half think that it's okay and the other think that it's not. The arguments justifying it go like this. Well, they're not actually people, or they're not full persons, or they're not really human, or they're not conscious, they can't even read. Have you ever seen a black person write? Those are the arguments they're making to justify slavery. Those are the arguments that the pro-choicers are making to justify abortion. And I'm looking at this, and I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, well, how did they fight it? Because what the abolitionists of slavery did is they fought it so effectively, and it was such an uphill battle because people had been fighting it so ineffectively, ineffectually, that they had an uphill battle. But they did such an amazing job that they took the country and they basically said, you cannot fight a war between the North and the South without it being about slavery. I don't want to go into the historiography. But they altered the entire public's opinion. The prior anti-slavery movement had these arguments. Slavery's bad because, look, it's gross. Look, see the whips and you whip that person and there's a picture and the abolitionists and it's just bad. So what we really need to do is end slavery because it's so bad. And but we don't like black people, so we'll have to colonize them. So the key to ending slavery, if we have to be principled and pragmatic about it, is to set up a colony in Liberia or a colony in Africa, and when it's ready and set up, we will slowly deport the Africans and emancipate them and make them free, and they can go back to their home country. Problem was, these were second and third generation Americans. They were not Africans. They didn't speak African. They were Americans. They were the children of slaves, so on and so forth. Another thing that they did, they thought it would be prudent. Well, the problem is that there's such an economic stronghold that what we need to focus our attention, this is the colonizationists, the anti-slavery societies prior to abolitionism in the 1830s. What we need to do is we need to focus our time and attention on amelioration. We'll send missionaries. We will send people there to make sure that they're being treated rightly and so on and so forth. And we can get money up together and we can compensate the slave owners for their loss. We can find slave holders some kind of other job. Some of you who are very familiar with the pro-life movement might be hearing me saying various ideas that are popular within the pro-life movement.
Or we can't abolish all of slavery. Maybe we'll start with this set of particular slaves. Or we'll start with slaves of a certain age. Or we'll start with slaves that had got here at a certain time. And then that'll be a success, and we'll be like, that'll be awesome, and then we'll do this, and then we'll do this, and then we'll abolish slavery, and we'll have done it. Some of the colonization societies had slavery being abolished in like 1957. It was like absurd. Look that up. I'm probably lying about the number. I think it was 37. Still absurd. So I'm looking at the whole thing. These guys are ideologues. And I think, and I didn't do this in any kind of scientific sense, but I did say, what are pro-lifers trying to do? What is the ideology of the pro-life movement? What's the strategy? What's the ideology? Strategy is at 7. This is ideology. What is that? We're going to save the babies. Really, that's awesome. Like, what's your ideology? Save as many babies as we can, man. Cool. I hope you save a lot of babies with that ideology. And like, you're talking, and you start, talking to pro-lifers online, it's constantly save the babies, save the babies, save the babies. I don't mean to be demeaning, but this is not an ideology. This is the fruit of an ideology, and probably when they decided at some point in time that they wanted to save the babies, it was because they were thinking, well, I'm a Christian, and Christians in a culture that kill their babies do this, and so I thought we need to start asking, what does Christianity look like in a culture that kills its children, not just in regard to saving babies, but what is Christianity? What is it? How does Christianity apply to abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, stem cell research, the gamut, everything in between? And, sorry, no warnings on the graphic images. And then I started to think, well, the deal is that black people look like humans to us. They look like persons. They seem rational. They seem like, totally with it. But people, Eric Metaxas taught me this, people in their culture, when they looked at, and you can look at their art, you can look at the art in the 19th century, the way they draw black people. They look more like monkeys than they did like people because they weren't seeing them right, because their worldview was so weird that they actually did not see them correctly, and so they did not see a human where we see a human. Our culture does not see a human where we see a human, or where there is a human. So this needs to be done, and we do it all the time. Clearly a baby. But I didn't see a lot of this in the pro-life movement. Personhood movement tries to do it all. But I don't see like a lot of propaganda saying like, hey, you see this cute human blastocyst? Like, it's like, save it. Because it's a difficult deal. So I decided that's the rhetoric and that's the terminology they have to do, because that is what it will take, because that's who we're talking about. And that's who we're going to be needing to protect. Tim took this picture yesterday, and Tim's not even here. Where's the Abolitionist Society of Nebraska? Sleeping. So all of that ends up with, I'm leaving the ivory tower. There's like a famous it's not famous, maybe you never heard of it. There's like a pro-life website where you can make a video. It's like, I'm giving up like French fries until abortion's abolished, or like, I'm giving up Coke until abortion's abolished. I'm giving up my PhD until abortion's abolished. That was all just that was my video. Did you get it? So I decided that this is what we need to do. Because what would Christianity look like? They didn't sit around and think, oh, let's have abolitionist societies and let's have them spread out, because that seems like a good idea. No, that's the actual fruit. If you are a Christian and you live in a culture that kills its children and you have an abortion clinic in your city, you are an abolitionist unless you are recreant to your Christian call, unless you are not being Christian. the world and the Christians in our culture are not guilty of not saving babies. They are guilty of not being Christians. So we set out to start an abolitionist movement, which G.K. Chesterton said is the most unpopular thing you can do. Man was a prophet. Well, you people are here, though. Okay, I don't know what time it is, but that's how we're going to start out the conference. I will say, I will do a little introduction for the rest of the day. This is how it's going to work. Matt Bodenhammer is going to provide what we believe as the abolitionist movement starters, igniters, or whatever, the biblical mandate for abolitionism. The sort of what we kind of call our kingdom theology. It's like the theological justification, and deal with things like keep the main thing the main thing. Then we are going to have Brian Wagnon, who is the director of the Abolition Society of Tahlequah, give a talk on the first abolitionists, who were the first Christians, and their fight against infanticide, child abandonment, and so on and so forth. Then we're all going to eat good food and talk about stuff after we listen to a killer good abolitionist song called Guard the Disregarded. Then we'll talk about true religion and deal with the question of abolitionism or evangelism, assistance, like crisis pregnancy centers, or agitation, like CBR, or maybe and. We're going to talk about ideology, Grant Keeter, and the immediatism properly understood and applied, and completely different from that which is parodied on Facebook. And then we're going to talk about one of our principal tenets, and that is to wake up the church. Todd Bullis is going to talk about his work in that area. And then we will get to hear from one of the sort of most active abolitionists in our culture. Sarah Cleveland will be talking about the daily work of an abolitionist. And then we will talk about that which is the key to abolishing abortion, the actual thing that's going to do it. It's not going to be AHA. It's going to be the gospel. And then we are going to hear from Dan Becker, who is wiser than us all, about what's going on and what we need to do in the culture that we are in. And then I'm going to sort of walk us through the 7 stages of what I believe will happen in the future if abortion is going to be abolished. So that'll be a history lesson from the future.